An embarrassingly long time ago, I bought this beautiful vintage sewing pattern off eBay for a very simple, classic 1940s blouse. It has been cut in the past, but overall it's in pretty good condition, and the colors on the envelope are still vibrant in the sunlight, given its age. Of course, I store it in the plastic bag that it came in a dark location. I just thought it would be worth it to film in the sunlight. It was printed in the US in 1942, and it cost 35 cents at the time. That's kind of mind-boggling, at least for me, because this is my very first vintage sewing pattern, and it's just really, really cool. Anyway, I'm going to be making it out of this blue-gray cotton. It's a really pretty color, and the only problem I have with it is that it matches with literally nothing. Since I didn't trust myself not to damage the original pattern, I bought a roll of that paper that they put on the exam tables at doctor's offices, yeah, that stuff, to trace the pattern onto. I made sure to get all the words and all the markings so that hopefully I'll never have to take this pattern out of its envelope ever again. I'll talk about my personal philosophy on handling vintage sewing patterns later. And I also took photographs of the instructions to work off of. To start, I laid all my pattern pieces onto the folded fabric. Something that really surprised me was that just like modern patterns, vintage ones also have cutting layouts, and very detailed ones at that, for various widths of fabric and styles of the pattern. I don't know why, but I figured they wouldn't be as detailed and wouldn't have as much information as modern patterns, but they do. As a beginner who's only sewed a couple things, all of which I'm not that proud of, this pattern did a really great job explaining how to make this shirt, and I was only mildly confused a couple of times. So I know this is only my very first project using a vintage sewing pattern, but owning about 4 at the writing of this script, I still wanted to talk about how I feel about preserving these things. Of course, my opinion is by no means the correct one, and I encourage you to form your own. So I like to touch the original pattern as little as possible in order to preserve it, because it is just paper, and basically tissue paper at that. And that's why I traced it onto my own paper and photographed the instructions and everything, and just tried to be as careful as I could with it. With that being said, these things are very common. There are tons listed on Etsy and eBay all the time, granted more from later decades than earlier ones. There's a lot of 40s patterns and even more 50s ones, but it kind of drops off in the 1930s and then they start getting really infrequent and expensive, in my experience. I bought this one for $7.50 USD, which is really cheap, further emphasizing that there's a lot of old sewing patterns in existence. Lots of people use these patterns just like any other pattern, of course pinning it to the tissue, cutting uncut pieces, using all the instructions. And I understand why they do that. They use these patterns just like any other person of the time would have. They're just another person in the story, enjoying the pattern. Sure, that may minimally damage it, but it's worth it to them. I don't see a problem with that, and I completely respect where they're coming from. However, to me, first, I just don't trust myself not to damage it, but secondly, as time goes on and these things get older and older and the paper starts to naturally degrade a little bit and wear down, I want my patterns to go into that in the best condition they can possibly be. So maybe I should just let them sit in my closet and never open them up ever. But then, what's the point in that? Sure, they exist, but they're not serving the purpose that they should be. So I trace them now, for the day when they're too delicate to trace, for myself and whoever else in the future wants to use them. It's another form of preservation, I guess, one that I kind of feel like it's my duty to do, as well as caring for the original. So that's my rant for today. I hope you're not literally falling asleep. Who knows, I could be completely wrong about all of this because, as I said, they're relatively common and inexpensive. Anyway, back to sewing. I'm using some tailor's chalk to mark these panels on the back, as well as any other markings on the pattern. This blouse front has a good amount to mark, mostly a large dart running down from the shoulders on each side. It's also got a placement for a patch pocket, and a line to fold back to form a facing at the front. The first step in the pattern was to pin the darts. One side was easy to do, just making sure the lines were even, but the other side was a bit different. It hadn't really occurred to me, but since the pieces are mirrored, I'd marked the wrong side of the fabric so that they were identical instead of symmetrical. It's not a huge deal, and honestly made marking the fabric easier, however, it just made things more difficult later on. Then I sewed the darts on my machine. If you've watched sewing videos on my channel before, then you know that I used to have a really cheap mini sewing machine from Amazon that was really difficult to use, leading me to hand sew things a lot, and honestly my hand sewing is really bad, so I was very grateful to get this machine and do things faster in neither. I also basted the pleats in the back. Next, I sewed on the yoke using a lapped seam. Basically, that means I sewed on this piece on the back and used a type of top stitching. At this point, I realized that it had been a terrible idea to be extremely cheap and not pay the $3 for a matching spool of thread. All the top stitching on the blouse is really evident, and I also had to do bound buttonholes to try and hide that as much as possible, which was something else. Thank goodness though, we are not up to that yet and are instead sewing the side seams. I stopped a couple inches from the bottom where it was indicated for the hem that kind of slopes upward at the sides. Next, I worked on the pocket, which had me a bit confused because it's kind of like a false pocket. The flap doesn't work how you'd think it would, and instead to access the pocket, there's an opening between the shirt and the pocket. Great script writing skills, am I right? It was top stitched into place, and the flap was meant to be ironed down, but I managed to procrastinate using the iron in my basement for literally the whole project. That's something that I should probably get better at because ironing is very important, and at the moment I barely do it. So no, none of the seams you're about to see in this program were ever pressed open. Don't try this at home. The collar piece was folded in half lengthwise, then stitched, but not flipped. One edge of the collar was stitched to the neckline, and the other edge was stitched to the facings at its ends. The facings had been folded in on both the front pieces off camera, by the way. Sadly, I wasn't able to use the Rumor, the automated buttonhole feature on my machine because of the contrasting thread colors, so I decided to try bound buttonholes instead. To get the general idea, I watched Retro Claude's video on them, yet, be warned, I modified her instructions heavily because I was lazy. I do not recommend doing that. Your buttonholes will not come out neatly and you will be sad. I'll link her video in the description box because it's a really great video, as long as you follow the instructions. Mistake number 1. Being lazy and cutting random sized patches for the lips of the buttonhole instead of actually measuring, so then they wouldn't come out way too small. Mistake number 2. Not being neat enough while stitching and just assuming it would be fine. This is when I realized that I'd cut my patches too small and stitched my boxes too big. And I wasn't about to unpick all those tiny stitches, so I had to just go with it and try my best to pin the lips of the buttonhole with the pitiful amount of fabric I'd allowed myself on the patches. Now, of course you can't see what I'm sewing behind my hand. Great camera angle on my part, but basically what I was doing was I was sewing across the short side of each buttonhole where the pins are to hold the pleats in place. Here's what the finished buttonholes look like. They're large and wrinkly and uneven, but at least they're marginally better than if I'd done them by machine with white thread. Then I can move on to the sleeves. Because of the amount of easing extra fabric I had to do to make them fit, I decided to hand sew them on. The seam looks really messy, and for once in my life I'm grateful I was too lazy to iron it. The fact that it wasn't ironed helps hide its unevenness. The front facing was covering my bound buttonholes, so I took the time to cut them open and fold them together. Thank goodness for this, because it helped hide the fact that I didn't have nearly enough fabric for the lips of the buttonhole. The facing on the other side was still loose, so I pinned it down before pinning and sewing the hem of the blouse. Then I carefully measured the distances from the buttonholes to the edge of the blouse. I marked the places for buttonholes with pins. These buttons are made of wood, and the cheapest ones I could find on Amazon that still look decent. They don't match the blouse as well as I'd pictured, but they still look nice and I can always use them on other projects. I really enjoy sewing on buttons, a lot more than their buttonholes. Lastly, the pattern called for a thread loop covered with buttonhole stitches to secure the topmost button. This is actually the second thread loop because I'd sewn the first one to the wrong side and had to remove it. Finally, I did all the small hand sewing finishing tasks, like finishing seams and stitching down facings. I really do enjoy hand sewing, especially finishing seams, because it's something to keep my hands busy while watching YouTube without feeling unproductive, kind of like crochet. After that, the blouse was finished. Overall, I think it came out quite nicely, though of course there are some small things that could be improved. Of course, the bound buttonholes are kind of messy, but I think I complained about them enough already. I also wish the blouse was a bit longer so that I could tuck it into pants more easily, but I guess that's what I get for not doing mock-up. Also, in case you were wondering, I also made the shorts that you can see me wearing in this clip. Originally, I was planning on adding the making process of those to this video as well, but I decided not to because I didn't want it to be too long. Also, one last thing. Wasn't the music in this video really good? Actually, it was composed by my friend Carter, who also has a channel here on YouTube, where he does really amazing music content. I'll link his channel in the description box, so feel free to stop by and subscribe. Also, if you feel like it, subscribe to me too. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.